Welcome back. We are halfway through the course. That means we're 4 weeks in. So far we've covered some of the theoretical ideas behind teaching, theoretical ideas behind learning, how memory works, etc. We've thought about some of the things that get in the way of learning. We've thought about things that create internal motivation or that produce external motivation. And we started to think about some of the very particular parts of teaching that we engage in. How do we build rapport with our students? How do we create an environment that is most likely, given the conditions that we have, to encourage all of our students to progress as best they can? And this last week we were thinking about how do we design a lesson. In the 4 weeks to come, we're going to continue to talk about specific elements of the teaching process. We're going to think about active learning this coming week in Module 5. We're going to think about syllabus design, assignment design, and feedback, both the feedback that we give to students and feedback that we get from students and from our peers, etc. And we're going to put all the pieces of our teaching portfolio together. But we're only halfway there. First, as always, I want to thank you for the participation on the forums. I've really been impressed by so many of you who have been so encouraging of each other, who will go through the posts, read the posts, respond in very encouraging ways about what you liked or appreciated or want to build on in terms of your peers' comments. That has been, I think, so useful in the development of a course culture here, and I really appreciate it. I'm particularly appreciative this week, both of, and I'm sorry if I'm messing up names, one of the problems, of course, with the online forums, I don't get to hear you pronounce your names, so forgive me if I mispronounce. George Kajas and Mohammed Imran Aslam, both of you contributed links when a couple of the links on this module were broken, that they didn't lead you where we wanted them to lead you. So thank you so much for doing a little bit of research and finding the good links for the rest of the class. I really appreciate that. Let's review very quickly Module 4. So in Module 4, we were talking about how we prepare and deliver lessons. And we started with the idea of universal design for learning, or backwards design. The idea of that, of course, is that we start with our learning outcomes. Where do we want students to end up? Whatever name we use to identify that final state, what is it? What do we want them to learn? What do we want them to be able to achieve? What do we want them to be able to do? Thinking to some of those active verbs in the revised version of Bloom's taxonomy. What do we want them to be able to analyze? What do we want them to create, etc. From there, we're thinking about how will students demonstrate that mastery, that competence, that control over the material that we want them to learn and to master. Once we've figured out how we're going to assess that, then we can figure out what are the activities that we'll need that will scaffold their journey to that final outcome. That's the basic idea of backwards design. And some of you in the forums offered more elaborate versions of this, not just assessments and unactivity, but assessments, activities, earlier formative assessments, earlier activities, etc., all the way back to wherever our students are when we encounter them at the beginning of that process. So that's backward design. And then we were thinking specifically about some of the organizational methods for a particular lesson. And there we were thinking both about small teaching, that is, breaking up lessons into 4 sections. What do we do to prepare students before this particular lesson begins? Homework, prior activities, before the lesson starts. What do we do in those introductory moments to set the stage, to figure out where our students are, or to get them in the mindset to prepare them for the activity that we're going to do that day? The body of the lesson, which may be made up of multiple activities, but what are the main activities? And then what do we do at the end to bring the pieces together, to allow students to pause for a moment and let things settle in the same way that when we think about reading, when we think about digesting material, we need to give the brain a chance to process that material and let it settle in. We can start that with what we choose to do at the end of a lesson. So that was small teaching, and we talked about storytelling. Now, of course, storytelling can be used to break the ice, to create rapport, to give life to our classes, but it's also an organizing structure. It can be very helpful for students to be able to place on the scaffold of a story the development of an idea, the development of a process that we're teaching, etc. Because most of us gravitate towards stories. We remember stories more vividly. Of course, there are caveats. A story with a lot of asides, a lot of tangents, confused narrative, hard to connect with the subject matter at hand, that's probably going to get in the way rather than be clarifying. So we need to be thoughtful and careful about those stories, but we were thinking about how those could be useful to us as well. So that was Module 4, and we may not always be successful. Just as our students need the chance to stumble at times as part of that learning process, we're going to stumble as well. There are going to be lessons that we try, that we plan, that we think we're prepared for, and they don't work. That is okay. That's part of our learning process as teachers. But we're trying to build a repertoire of organizational schemes, of ways of presenting material that really energize and connect with our students and help them to remember and master it. And that's a good segue then to what we're doing in Module 5. Module 5 is all about active learning. It's about what we do not to simply lecture to our students. There are times and places where a lecture may be appropriate. But what do we do to engage them in their own learning process? What do we do to give them a kind of hands-on experience? These can be things as simple as think, pair, share. You provide a prompt, students have a few minutes to think about it, maybe to write down some notes. They share their ideas with a partner, and then those partnerships share with the class. That's think, pair, share. Maybe it's about creating a formalized debate in a class. Maybe it's about a kind of hands-on demonstration. We want to think about a broad array of active learning techniques that we can use. Some of them we'll gravitate towards because they fit our personality better, because they fit our subject matter better, and that's fine. We just want a rich repertoire rather than an impoverished one which forces us to go back to the same well over and over again. That well will provide sustaining drink for some of our students, but probably not all of them. And so we want to think about having a mixture of different techniques so that we can adapt to the students that we have. And so that really gets to the assignments for this week. You are going to see that the major assignments for this week seem like they're repetitive, because they are. But they're repetitive not because I want you to be presenting the same active learning technique over and over again, but rather so that you have 3 separate chances to think through a different active learning technique. So at least we have a handful of options when we're going into the classroom next. First, there's a small group discussion. This is 5.3. And what it asks you to do is to think about a good active learning technique. To go off and teach someone. It could be a friend, it could be somebody in your family, it could be a student if you actually have classes. But the idea is to try out an active learning technique, teach it to someone, and then come back to the small group discussion forums and discuss what worked or didn't about that attempt to teach with an active learning technique. So that's the first go at this. You do not have to record this time around. Then we have the 5.4, that's the portfolio submission. So the idea is to have you think through very carefully, what's the active learning technique I might use? Why would it be appropriate given what I am trying to teach? And what do I need to prepare in terms of the environment to make that work? Do you need to be able to move desks and chairs around? Do you need to be in a particular kind of space? Do you need particular materials? Paper, chalk, pens, whatever the case may be. That's 5.4. There is also this week another peer review activity, and that's 5.7. The initial submission will be due Saturday night, then that will turn over. Try to make sure the system just gives you 3 responses to work with this time, not 6. And then you'll respond to your peers sometime before Tuesday. The peer review is going to seem really familiar. You are going to first choose a learning outcome, because we don't want to lose that sense of backwards design. What's a learning objective that you have? You're going to provide a detailed description of the activity and how it should be completed. And then you're going to explain the alignment between your choice of active learning techniques and the desired learning objective. So in line with backwards design, I've got my learning objective, I've chosen this technique. Let me explain why those two are correlated, why they align. And finally, you're going to explain why this is appropriate given your discipline. Or maybe you're going to say that this is not something done in your discipline, but it should be, and give an explanation for that. The purpose here is to build a repertoire. And so giving you 3 chances to test out 3 active learning techniques is a way of building that repertoire. That's Module 5. I know from this past week that a lot of you are thinking about these kinds of active learning techniques already. How you engage your students in real-world cases. How do you get students to think about the connection between what you're doing in the classroom and what happens in your profession, or what happens when they try to utilize that material in the outside world. So I know you're thinking in those terms, and you'll be able to develop that and share more with your small group forums and with the full class forums as well. I look forward to that, and I'll see you again next week.